As if my TBR wasn't already long enough. So recently, Ola on the Wild Witch channel and also Joanna did videos about books they would like to reread. And I thought, yeah, that's a good idea. I have a years-long TBR. Why not add a whole bunch of really big books that I love that I want to reread to that very long TBR? Rereading is interesting. I highly encourage people to reread good books. If a book really is well written and it's got some subtlety to it and there's some depth to the character portrayals and the themes involved, I always get a lot more out of it after rereading it at least once. So a lot of these are books that I've read more than twice, but they're still on my reread list. Another good reason for rereading, I think, is just comfort. Rereading a book that you know that you love is not a risk in comparison to a brand new book that you may not love. It's also like seeing old friends again. It's just a really enjoyable thing, just like it's comforting and fun to get together with a friend and have a beer. Sitting down with characters that you spent time with before and getting into their lives again and seeing them do interesting, cool things again is always fun. So this list is not a ranking in any sense of the word. You can take all of these as recommendations because I've read all of them at least once already and I want to reread them at least once again. What it is maybe a priority sorting. The ones that I just feel like I'd like to reread the soonest are at the front of the list, and it sort of goes back to one day at the end of the list. But it's not strict. It's just sort of like my mood right now. I think I want to reread the next one on the list sooner than the ones that are later in the list. Also, I have a weird relationship with books, especially longer series, when it takes quite a while for them to come out. Many of these I've reread only because I have a garbage pile of a memory and I had read one book and then it took years for the next one to come out, and by the time it came out I just went back to the beginning and read the first one again or the previous ones again. And the first one on my list is definitely one of those. A Song of Ice and Fire. If you don't know what that is, I don't know why you're here, but it's the series that the TV show Game of Thrones was based on, 6 of the best seasons in television. And it's super complex. It's pretty thick. Each of the books is pretty chunky just by itself. And I read, I think, the first 2 or 3 years before the television show, and when I heard that there was going to be a television show, I went back and I read the ones I had already read and the one new one that there was, and then sometime after the television show, I think I read all of them maybe again and the newest one. Who knows when the series is going to be finished? It was originally going to be, I think, a trilogy. Now I think he said it's going to be 7 books. He could change his mind about that. But even though they're not finished, I enjoyed them so much, obviously, that I would be super happy to reread them again. And on the Grimoire Discord, I'll link to that down in the description, the people in the Grimoire Discord were talking about a reread starting in January. And then I talked to different people and I figured out eventually that that idea originally came from Joanna and a couple of other ladies who wanted to get together and reread it together. And they were going to use the Grimoire Discord as their discussion platform. And a bunch of people on the Grimoire Discord are excited about it, who have not read it before or are rereading it, and I'm going to join in that. So in January, there will be a lot of A Song of Ice and Fire content on a lot of different channels and on the Discord. So if you want to join, check out the Grimoire Discord. Let me know in the comments, and we will, a bunch of us, reread that and discuss it together. Looking forward to it. Another one that is in a similar state to A Song of Ice and Fire is The Gentlemen Bastards. The first book, which you may have heard of, is The Lies of Loch Lamora. I read these years ago, the first three, which are the only ones that are out, and I loved them. If you like thieves, if you like buddies, if you like heists, if you like sort of maybe Renaissance Italy is kind of the feeling of it. Not so much magic, but a really, really great character story. I really, really loved them. The fourth book is finally coming out next year, I'm told. Amazon has it on sale for pre-order, so I'm assuming that it's relatively certain that it's coming out. Scott Lynch, the author, he's been quite open about difficulties he's had in his personal life and that he just hasn't been able to write it. I don't remember when the third book came out, but it's been years, and then the fourth one hopefully next year. It's also meant to eventually be a 7-book series, and that may take some time. I know that in the interim, he has put a novella in between the first and second book. So there's 1, 1.5, and 2, and 3 are already out. I'm really looking forward to rereading these. With anything on this list, if you are interested in reading it for the first time or rereading it, let me know, and we could do a read-along at some point. I would love to do that. But yeah, definitely Gentlemen Bastards, highly recommended, and I will definitely reread it maybe in the next year. I'd like to get a reread done before the fourth book comes out, which should be, I think, next summer. I think it's meant to be in August. Another one is kind of a difficult one for me. It's the Chronicles of Thomas Covenant, the Unbeliever. It's a portal fantasy where a guy who has a pretty horrible life, he's a leper. He has leprosy. He's an outcast in our world. He has basically no social contact and no friends and no woman in his life, and he's pretty miserable. He suddenly lands in a fantasy world through stuff for reasons, and discovers that his white gold wedding ring is magic in that world, and that everyone thinks that he is a reincarnation or a return of a legendary hero. And it's a difficult book because the main character, Thomas Covenant, is extremely unlikable. But there are lots of other characters in the magic world that he ends up in who are considerably more likable. And it explores his difficulties, his personality as a character, and how it evolves through his experiences in the land. It's called the magic world he lands in. It's sort of 2 trilogies and then 4 books at the end. I read the 2 trilogies, the 6 books, when I was a teenager. The 4 books were written much, much later, and everything I've heard about them is that they're not really very good and not really worth reading. But the first 6 books, I loved them when I was a teenager, and I'm a little nervous to reread those, partially because I think you can sometimes ruin your good memory of a series by rereading it later. Things I liked when I was a teenager, I'm not necessarily going to like now. So I'm kind of curious to reread it and see if it's quite good, or if it is something I only liked because I was a teenager. But I have very good memories of it, and I would like to reread it. Raf Blutaxt recently reread it and had some extremely intelligent thoughts about it, which is a lot of the reason that it kind of, I feel like it would be really good to reread sometime soon, actually. I really look forward to rereading the First Law trilogy by Joe Abercrombie. When I read those, only that trilogy was out. So everything set in that world didn't exist yet, because I read them quite a while ago. And I read those first 3 and really loved them. I'd like to get into the rest, but to be honest, those books are so vague in my memory that I feel like I should reread those first if I really want to get into the rest of what he's done with that world. So I definitely want to reread those. A reread which kind of frightens me is The Realm of the Elderlings. This is probably the messiest series in my reading history. I read the first trilogy when they came out. In fact, I think I read the first two of that trilogy before the third one was out. And then the third one came out, and I went back and read the first two again, and I read the third one. And then for years, I didn't read any Robin Hobb. I wasn't paying attention. I wasn't aware of what else she was doing. And eventually, I realized there was another series. So I read The Live Ship Traders, and so on and so forth. And it was all very piecemeal, and I'd read one and then I'd reread it because the next one had come out. And so some of her books, the Realm of the Elderlings books anyway, I've probably read 4 times, but some of them I've only read once. And I think the very last trilogy, or is it a quadrology? I don't know that I've read all of those. So I'd like at some point to read all 16 of them again, now that they're all out and the whole thing is finished. But 16 books is kind of intimidating, but maybe as a long-term project. Side story, I had not read fantasy at all for a long time, maybe 10 years. I moved to Sydney and I thought, I'd like to get back into fantasy books. And I found I believe it's called a Galaxy Bookshop. Shout out to the Galaxy Bookshop guys. And that's where I realized that the Live Ship Traders was out, that it existed at all. And I immediately grabbed all of it. And then next to it, there was a little sign that said, "Meet Robin Hobb. She's coming to our shop. And she'll be doing signings, and she'll be doing a reading, and blah, blah, blah." And I was like, oh, wow, this is such good timing. And then I looked at it, and the date was the previous weekend. Yep. So off of the fantasy track, something I really, really want to reread, and I've read it, I believe, 3 times. And it is the book I have recommended the most in my life. I have made at least 10 people read this book. It is Hyperion by Dan Simmons. Hyperion is an amazing science fiction novel. It's definitely my favorite science fiction. Sorry, Frank Herbert. But Hyperion is such a good story. It uses the structure of the Canterbury Tales. So there is a trip that a bunch of people are going on. They're going on a long voyage. And as they're going on their voyage, they're telling each other their stories. So there's sort of the overarching umbrella story, and then there's all of these individual stories of the individual people. And it's so well told, and each of the different stories has its own flavor. Each of these different characters, when they tell their stories, have a very clear personality and voice. There's a story that feels like kind of a detective story, and there's another story that feels like kind of a military fiction story, and they all weave together in such an amazing way. My recommendation for it, a lot of people I've heard say who read it for the first time, that you can read the first 2 books and not read the 3rd and the 4th book. So there's Hyperion, Fall of Hyperion, Endymion, and Rise of Endymion. And I would say that's bullshit. Do not listen to them. If you're going to read the first one, do read all 4. You certainly can't read just the first one because it's a cliffhanger. It ends at a certain point and you think, oh my God, what happens next? And you have to go on to the second one immediately, basically. You could read just the first 2. I think they're a pretty complete story, but there are a lot of mysteries that aren't explained, and there are a lot of things that get further explored in the 3rd and 4th book that I definitely think are worth reading. A reread that makes me slightly nervous is The Book of the New Sun by Gene Wolfe. If you've never read it or heard of it, it is a very well written but very complex story, and there are lots of things going on that are hard to understand, and you really need to follow it quite closely. And it starts like a fantasy novel. It seems like it's maybe a fantasy novel, but it becomes relatively clear very quickly that this is actually far future, and it's on Earth, and the sun is dying, and society, culture, everything is kind of degenerating. So it feels like it's medieval, but every now and then a laser gun will show up, or something that seems to be a spaceship. And it's definitely technically science fiction, but it feels a lot like a fantasy novel, and it relies very heavily on an extremely unreliable narrator. The main character, Severian, is telling the story, and it becomes pretty clear pretty quickly that he's telling it in some sort of future, and he has an agenda. So he's not just telling exactly what happened. It's a really, really interesting story, even though I think I probably only understood about 75% of it. I would love to reread it with some people who are smarter than me and who get a lot of the allusions and references to other things that I don't really understand necessarily. I'm sure I would get a lot more out of it. I've seen that AP Canavan has it on his shelf behind him in his videos. AP, if you want to reread it, I'd be up for it. But really, really engrossing story where you feel like there's always more to get out of it. So it's definitely worth a reread. A really old school classic fantasy that I read also when I was a teenager is Elric of Melniboné. The Elric story is the inspiration for a lot of things. A lot of people have said, that the Geralt of Rivia character out of The Witcher is basically a reference to Elric. Anybody who has an evil sword which can talk is a reference to Elric. I think his sword, Stormbringer, was probably the first evil sword. It's a really interesting change of pace. It's pretty old school in its style and the way it's written. The original books were quite thin. They're coming out with these larger hardbound, like 3 books in one kind of things now. There's 2 of them out. There's a 3rd one coming out, I think, next year. But they are really, really well told, very adventurous, dark magic, demons, all of the good stuff. It's very heavy metal. In fact, a lot of heavy metal bands have referenced Elric in some way or another. So definitely a good book for a reread. One of my favorite old school fantasy series is the Chronicles of Amber by Roger Zelazny. They are also, I think, massively influential. If you're following my channel and you're into the Malazan world, the Deck of Dragons reminds me so clearly of the trumps from the Amber novels. The trumps are cards with usually a person on them, and if you concentrate on the card, you can establish a mental contact to that person, and it also opens essentially a portal to that person or for them to you. So you can actually go to where they are, or they could come to where you are. You can also paint trumps of places and go to that place by concentrating on the card. It's a really interesting portal fantasy, although it's not really portal fantasy, technically. There are an infinite number of dimensions, and at one end of the spectrum of all dimensions is Amber, which is a fantasy kingdom, but it is one of the only things that is absolutely stable and absolutely real in all of the dimensions. All of the dimensions between Amber and Chaos are called Shadow. So our Earth that we live in real life is a shadow in between Amber and Chaos. Chaos is also permanent and real, but it's chaos, so it's chaotic. And depending on where in Shadow a particular dimension or world lies, it is either more chaotic or more stable, like Amber. And the story centers around the royal family of Amber and the intrigue about who gets the throne. Typical sort of fantasy stuff, but this was also written back in the 70s, I believe. And the original books are as thick as one of your fingers. They're actually not huge, but there are 10 of them. There's one series focusing on Corwin, one of the princes of Amber, and then there's another series, 5 and 5, the second one focusing on Corwin's son, Merlin. And you could probably just read the first one, which all of those 5 together are probably about as thick as any fantasy book you've read this year. Because back in the day, they used to write thin books. Seems like authors have forgotten how to do that. But these are classic fantasy influences for many, many, many modern authors. And I'd love to reread them. I'd also like to get to the Earthsea Chronicles again by Ursula K. Le Guin. They're a bit fairy tale feeling in the way that they're told, but as I remember it, they're also a little bit depressing. There's a mood in them which is a little bit dark, but I remember them being extremely well written. I read them also back when I was a teenager. And haven't reread them since then, but I'd really like to give them a try, and I've been seeing them pop up on BookTube in different places recently, so some modern readers are also getting into them and enjoying them. If you have read my t-shirt, you can imagine that I would like to reread Dune. It's not very high on this list, it's kind of towards the end, the list is almost done. Because I reread it a couple of years ago. When I heard that they were making a movie, I just said, okay, I'm going to reread it. And I believe I only read the first book again, maybe the second one as well, Children of Dune, or Dune Messiah. But I love those books. I've reread them many times. The first time I read them again, I was a teenager. And I think every decade since then, maybe, I've reread them. And they're very different. The first one is very readable science fiction. The second one starts getting a bit philosophical. Not that much happens. As it goes on, less happens and more thinking. But the thoughts are amazing. A lot of old science fiction, like Asimov, for example, seems to be much more about an idea. There's a big idea about technology, about something that could happen in the future, about alien civilizations, about how humans deal with aliens. Whatever the big idea is, the book is much more about that. And it's much less about action and character, usually. And Dune is not really an exception. The characters are not super deeply written. There are some very, very big ideas in it, and the ideas become much more the point the further on the series goes, but I loved them. I really, really enjoyed them. Just an amazing idea of the future, and extremely deep with the history and the different cultures and the way everything works. It's just, they're stunning books, and they've also been huge influence on so many different things. I would really love to reread those, but it might take a few years. The Black Company is a series I read, I think in my 20s, so a while ago. I burned through them, and I think I overdid it because I don't believe I really finished everything that was there, but I read a whole bunch of them. I really enjoyed them. As soon as I started reading Malazan for the first time, I went, oh, yeah, okay. This is definitely influenced by the Black Company. So as far as military fantasy goes, it's the best I've ever heard of, excepting maybe Malazan. Just really gritty, believable soldier's life kind of things. The author was in Vietnam, as far as I understand. It really gives you a feeling. I've never served in the military. I'm happy that I never had to, but it really gives you a feeling for what it's like being a soldier on campaign in a dangerous situation. And also the idea of a mercenary company that You can't really trust even the people who hired you. You stick together. It's a very found family kind of trope. The soldiers in the mercenary company kind of have to stick together because they can't depend on anyone else outside of the group. Really, really exciting and kind of heartbreaking at times books. And last but definitely not least, Lord of the Rings. The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings are the first adult novels that I can remember reading ever. My mother, when I was 9 years old, gave me a box set of The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings. And I read all of them and immediately reread all of them. And since then, I've kind of made a habit of every 5 or 10 years rereading it. I don't remember how many times I've read it. I own 5 editions of Lord of the Rings. I've read it over 10 times. It's the absolute highest level of comfort food reading for me. And I will definitely read it again. I'm not in a rush, but it's something I go back to over and over again just because I know it's dependable. I know it's enjoyable. And I miss the characters after a while. I miss the world. Middle-earth is amazing. And I love being in it. So let me know down in the comments, which ones of these have you read? Which ones of these would you like to read? Would you be interested in doing a read-along at some point? I'm really interested in getting a group of people together to really focus on a book and discuss it as we read it. And as always, keep reading awesome books, and I'll see you next time.